Ready or not, Pokémon 7th generation is on its way, bringing new pocket monsters and more spin-off games than you could ever possibly want. As is customary before a new gen begins, it's time to look back at the series and pit each previous generation against one another. You know, in the spirit of animal fighting. In this video, we're going to rank all 6 Pokémon generations, but we're not just taking the core games or rosters into account. Instead, we're taking a look at how successful the series was as a whole in the gaming world. That means we're looking at side games too. So we had to dig deep and try to remember what the hell Pokemon Dash even was. So with that in mind, here's our power rankings of Pokemon generations. Taking the last place spot is Generation 4. The series' DS debut started fine enough with its par for the course core entries in Diamond and Pearl. Unfortunately, there's not much to remember past those games other than Garchomp, who probably haunts your dreams every night before you go to sleep. The Pokemon Company tried their hardest to create spin-offs that could function as their own series, but the critical response was lukewarm. The late 2000s to early 2010s saw the release of 3 Mystery Dungeon games and 2 Ranger titles, none of which have had a lasting impact. The home console front fared even worse with the poorly received stadium-style Battle Revolution, a throwaway Wii title in Rumble, and the overly kid-friendly Pokepark. Gen 4 capped things off with suitable remakes of Gold and Silver, which came bundled with a neat but disappointing pedometer that gave your Pokemon experience based on the amount of steps you took, or the amount of rotations the fan you attached it to made. Because, let's be honest, who actually said, "Time to raise my Lucario, better go for a brisk jog"? We give Generation 4 a C- rating. Next up is Generation 5, the Black and White era. Once again, the main games in this period were serviceable enough by Pokemon standards, though they took a big gamble by featuring an entirely new roster of Pokemon. That move gives them 5 points for boldness, but it also gave us some of the worst creature designs in the series. It introduced a literal garbage Pokemon, which kinda says it all. The series went all in on the new, ditching nostalgic secondary remakes for full-scale Black and White sequels. But for the most part, this period felt like a continuation of the Diamond and Pearl years, with more middling Rumble and Dungeon games lining shelves. The real spin-off ace in the hole here came in the form of Pokemon Conquest, an Advance Wars-like turn-based strategy game, which went on to become one of the best reviewed side games in the Pokemon canon. That bright spot gives Gen 5 a slight edge over Gen 4. But barely. I mean, really, there's a 3-stage ice cream cone Pokemon because of this period. We give this generation a C rating. This next pick might be controversial for the nostalgic Pokemon fans, but Generation 2 rounds out our lower tier. Let's be clear, there's a lot to love about the Gold and Silver days. The game added great new mechanics, starting to flesh out its more simplistic predecessors, and many of the Pokemon added here are still beloved fan favorites to this day. But if we're talking about the period as a whole, there's not much more to say. The series only got 2 real side titles here, Pokemon Stadium 2 and Puzzle Challenge, both of which were sequels to Gen 1 titles. Basically, Gen 2 feels like it was rushed out of the gate to capitalize off of Red and Blue's incredible momentum, which was good and bad for gamers. It's good because, hey, it certainly wasn't broke, but bad because it didn't strive too hard to expand the brand. That said, it's hard to rate this too harshly considering that the Pokemon Empire only grew more powerful in this time. Now, if we were counting movies, this would get so many extra points for that creepy as hell avant-garde Entei movie.
I am Molly's real father, as long as that is her wish.
Generation 2 gets a rating of a C+. Kicking off our top 3 is this current generation, numero 6. The X and Y years have been massive for Pokemon, revitalizing the series with new core game mechanics that have made competitive play far more accessible than ever. The Pokemon Company really took advantage of the 3DS here, pushing the series forward and setting some exciting groundwork and high standards for Sun and Moon. Plus, it introduced Mega Evolution, successfully mixing up the tried and true formula just enough to change the metagame and make Arceus into an overpowered horror show. Of course, things have been hit or miss outside of X and Y. Free-to-play Pokemon games like Shuffle and Picross became major pieces of the Pokemon's business model, while the Dungeon series clunked along. But on the flip side, we also got the surprisingly fun Pokken Tournament, giving players the ability to brutalize Pikachu with Machamp. And of course, we're all still recuperating from the Pokemon Go craze of July. All that said, it might be a little premature to rank this one, considering we're still waiting on Detective Pikachu, which may or may not feature Danny DeVito voicing Pikachu.
This. I am not a human being! I am an animal! Cold-blooded!
Luckily, we'll have another shot at re-ranking things in 3 to 4 years, so for now, we have spoken. We give this generation a B rating. Generation 3 gets our runner-up spot, and for good reason. Ruby and Sapphire brought Pokemon off the Game Boy and into the Advanced era, really solidifying the game's central mechanics and structure. It also brought along a whole slew of great creatures, like a camel with a volcano on its back that can explode, or a drunk panda. Ultimately, Gen 3 did a great job at ushering in a new era while still building on nostalgia. Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green were a charming blast from the past. Coliseum kept the Stadium series alive, and the Ruby and Sapphire themed pinball sequel was a welcome surprise. The Pokemon Company even gave us a little tease of what a full console Pokemon RPG would look like in Pokemon XD, though not quite enough to fill the eternal void deep within our souls. Despite all those pluses, Gen 3 had plenty of flaws. The middling Ranger and Dungeon series both started here. Plus, Pokemon Box and Channel both pushed the limits of what disc people would buy as long as it had that big yellow logo on it. And seriously, let me reiterate, what the hell is Dash? Did we black out when the DS came out, or are we just really good at repressing things? Look, a franchise with that many releases is never going to be perfect, but the pros definitely outweighed the cons here, making for a memorable few years for the Game Boy Advance and GameCube fun. Oh, and apparently the DS. Seriously, what is Dash? We give this generation a B+. And finally, our top spot goes to... oh, come on, who didn't see this coming? Generation 1 is still the gold standard for Pokemon, and not just because of our gushy childhood memories. Sure, Gen 1 does get major props for starting the entire Pokemon phenomenon and producing dozens of great mascots and, also Tangela, but it's easy to only focus on Red and Blue and overlook just how great every spin-off was at the time. Let's count them off, shall we? Stadium made a nice little niche on the N64, setting the focus strictly on competitive battles. Pinball was a highly addictive handheld game that even came with its own built-in Rumble Pack. Puzzle League's tight gameplay appealed to both Pokemon fans and puzzle fanatics alike. Hey You Pikachu was a cute little spectacle that allowed kids to call Pikachu a piece of shit to his digital face. Game Boy's Pokemon trading card game adaptation successfully translated the fun of pretending you understood the card game into a video game. And, of course, Pokemon Snap was an incredibly memorable experience that gave new meaning to Gotta Catch 'Em All, and also proved that Professor Oak doesn't know anything about photographic composition. Ever heard of Rule of Thirds, Oak? Look it up, you senile peon. All in all, there's a reason Pokemon became a global phenomenon at this time. Even the throwaway games were quality productions, which hasn't always been the case in recent years. Red and Blue may have hooked players, but these games gave them a reason to keep loving the franchise, keeping it fresh year after year after year after year after year. Okay, we confess. This is really just our number one because of Charizard. Hashtag sorry not sorry. We give this generation an A rating. We'll see where Sun and Moon fit into all this soon enough, but in the meantime, what do you think of our power rankings? Were we too harsh on Diamond and Pearl? Are we overrating the Ruby and Sapphire era? Let us know in the comments. And please be sure to tweet with